Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and our ongoing study in Church Dogmatics by Brunner. We're going to look at the first half of chapter 12, be pages 152 to 162, and the previous lesson looked at faith as personal and subjective. In this lesson, we look at faith as an objective concept. Faith as an objective concept. And especially how it progressed from Old Testament meaning to New Testament meaning. So now we look at the objective side, the actual concept of faith. Let's go to block 1. Okay, the Old Testament concept of faith is on its way to the apostolic New Testament meaning in 3 stages. First, it is a reciprocal relation between God and man. But God initiates this relation. It involves the entire person, and Isaiah even focuses on this idea of faith. It is also a special form of existence as a covenant relationship with Yahweh, a condition of reaching security, a security in God's faithfulness on his side of the covenant. Therefore, it does include hopeful anticipation. The Israelites anticipated the faithfulness of God in covenant relationship. So third, it is an eschatological concept of hope. God gives the self the power to believe. The covenant tradition points to reciprocal and personal relation. This is faith on its way to becoming Paul's concept of pisteuo, faith, the New Testament concept. But there is a difference, but the reason Brunner brings this up, because basically he's going to take the position of Paul, but who is Paul? He was a Pharisee of the Pharisees of the tribe of Benjamin. He was very familiar with these 3 stages of faith in the Old Testament. As a member of the Pharisees, as a member of the tribe of Benjamin, he knew that covenant relationship was a reciprocal relation, a special form of existence, and it was an eschatological existence of hope. All of those apply to Paul. But something happened, because in that apocalypse of Damascus, Paul took these 3 aspects of covenant meaning for faith, and it radically changed. And we're going to look at that in block 2. Like I said, all of this applies to Paul, for Brunner, but in block 1 we have where Paul began in his Jewish understanding as a Pharisee. Now block 2, we take a look at how Paul altered that understanding after the apocalypse of Damascus and his encounter with the risen Christ. Let's go to block 2. For Paul, faith and assurance are placed radically outside the self. Now this is a transformative understanding for Paul. God's self-communication had not been fully realized in the Old Testament. The historical and the personal had not yet become one in Christ. In Christ, God's historical act and God's historical word become united in the personhood of Christ. Faith becomes united with agape, because for the first time, Paul came to understand self-sacrificial love in the cross of Christ. And then also the Apostle John in 1 John 4:19, we love him because he first loved us. So Paul, in his understanding as a Pharisee, began with a covenant understanding of faith as a reciprocal relation, and that continues But now that reciprocal relation is founded on a revelation in Christ. He was confronted by the risen Christ in the apocalypse of Damascus. So now he understands faith as a self-sacrificial love. Faith begins in the self-sacrificial love of Christ, the Christ who was crucified and raised. In other words, now for Paul, faith is imprinted with the cross. Now, reciprocal relation is imprinted with the cross of Christ. Paul still understands faith as a reciprocal relation, but now it's new. It has become something entirely new because now it's deeply imprinted by the cross of Christ. So, block 2, note 2, we get the Pauline apostolic understanding of faith. And this is absolutely, I agree with this, with Brunner's reformed position here. In faith, confidence is placed radically outside the self. That is the truth that happened for Paul after being confronted by the risen Christ. What Paul say? To live is to live in Christ. To die is to die in Christ. Whether I live or whether I die, I remain in Christ. I proclaim Christ and Christ crucified. This is the theological position of Paul. His identity is found outside himself. And Brunner rightly declares that faith and the assurance of faith for Paul is found radically outside the self, because his identity is en Christos. His identity is in Christ. His faith is in Christ. What did Romans 1:17 say? Faith is understood as faith to faith. The righteousness of God is understood as faith to faith. What does that mean? It means from the faith of Christ to the faith of the believer. It means reciprocal relation. Something that was present in the Old Testament in the covenant. So reciprocal relation continues, but now it's imprinted by the cross of Christ. This reciprocal relation is a imprinted reciprocal relation, and Paul's identity is radically outside the self. Faith is radically outside the self. And the ethnic Israel becomes replaced by the church. Key, the historical character of faith emerges in the Christ who is prophet, king, and priest. For Paul, faith has become a dialectical and reciprocal relationship in the Christ who transcends us, and yet the Christ who abides with us. Hupomeno, the Christ who abides with us, as we abide in Christ. Again, reciprocal covenant relation. Christ abides in us as we abide in Christ. The Greek concept hupomeno. It means to abide. Hupomeno, if you translate it in a very literal way, it means to abide under the lordship of Christ. Hupa is under. Menas is remain. It means to remain under the lordship of Christ. We translate it as abide. Hupomeno. It means to remain under the lordship of Christ. We translate it in English, abide in Christ. Hupomeno. But it's a dialectic, because we abide in the Christ who transcends us, and we abide in the Christ who is with us, alongside our suffering, alongside our trials, alongside every struggle, alongside every mountain we have to climb in our existence, whatever that might be. Everyone has their own challenges. Whatever that challenge might be, we don't face the challenge alone. We face the challenge with the Christ who abides with us, with the Christ who suffers with us, with the Christ who promises resurrection over that situation. And so for Paul, reciprocal relation has been imprinted by the cross of Christ. And for Paul, Block 2, Note 2a. In faith and in confidence, they are placed radically outside the self for Paul. Paul finds righteousness in Christ. Faith is from Christ, and it becomes a faith event within which we participate, but it's gifted to us in Christ. Everything for Paul is in Christ. Everything. So faith is posited radically outside the self. That is a circle Block 2, Note 2, subpoint A. That's the key to the whole lesson. Block 2, Note 2, subpoint A. Faith is placed radically outside the self for Paul. He's still a Pharisee of the Pharisees. He's still of the tribe of Benjamin. But he has passed through the apocalypse of Damascus. He has been confronted by the call of Christ in the resurrected Christ in the apocalypse of Damascus. Remember, apocalypse means the unveiling of truth. Truth was unveiled to Paul in Damascus. Divine truth. It was an apocalypse. It radically changed his life. No longer could he live according to works righteousness. Now he understood righteousness. According to Romans 1:17, righteousness comes from God, from faith to faith. From faith to faith. From the faithfulness of Christ. Take a look at Philippians chapter 2, all of it. From the faithfulness of Christ to the realization of the faith of the believer. From faith to faith. Dialectical faith event relationship. From faith to faith. Romans 1:17. So we wrap up with a negation. We went from the Old Testament understanding in Block 1 as faith as a covenant reciprocal relation that was eschatological in nature, to the transition to the New Testament, where faith is radically posited outside the self. As Paul says over 600 times, en Christos. He says that over 600 times in his letters. Faith is posited radically outside the self. Brunner is correct. Now, we negate, neo-orthodoxy is all about negating liberalism. And Brunner references a liberal here. He references Martin Buber. And he says Buber falsely interpreted Paul's theology as containing elements of Gnostic theology. So note Block 3, Buber's position is that of liberal theology. He says that the Old Testament faith consisted of trust and obedience, but Paul's theology contained Gnostic elements, and it was faith in doctrine, faith in Gnostic doctrine. Faith becomes completely altered in Martin Buber. But this position must be negated, says Brunner. It contradicts the biblical apostolic witness. Instead, faith is always an answer to God's self-communication in history, culminating in an event and prophetic word, culminating in the Christ event, which is the final realized divine self-communication. And for Paul, his theology is deeply imprinted with the cross of Christ. Paul can only understand faith as a faith imprinted by the cross of Christ. And that means covenant becomes a new covenant imprinted by agape, self-sacrificial love. Where did Paul discover that? Over many years of study after the apocalypse of Damascus. It took him many, many years, but he completely relearned his theology and transitioned from a Pharisee of Pharisees to becoming the first New Testament theologian. And in his letter to the Romans, Romans 1:17, he describes faith as an event of faith to faith, faith unto faith, beginning with the faithfulness of Christ, revealed to us in the cross, explained in Philippians chapter 2, resulting in the gift of faith to the believer. Righteousness is acquired from faith to faith. So it's a very important lesson on the objective concept of faith. That wraps up 12a. And next time we wrap up 12, it'll be 162 to 175, and it'll wrap up chapter 12. But that wraps up an excellent lesson on the Old Testament concept, the New Testament concept, and the negation of any Gnostic ideas. It'll wrap up 152 to 162. We'll finish up chapter 12 next time.